Hello everyone. Today we are in conversation with Molly Tallberg. Molly is a fourth-year doctoral student in developmental psychology at the University of Chicago, working with Dr. Lynn Byen in the Early Social Thinkers Lab. In her research, Molly is exploring gender-based stereotype biases about the ability in math and science that emerge in children, how children develop these beliefs, how they're shaped by border assumptions about gender, and what influences these bias. That's a very interesting topic. Prior to her Chicago PhD, Molly earned a BA in psychology with a minor in chemistry at NYU, where she also served as a lab major at Andre Simpion's Cognitive Development Lab, deepening her expertise in the origins of academic and cognitive stereotypes in young children. And now a fun fact about Molly is that on occasion she was my horse riding instructor, so we both share a love for horses.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. That was awesome. So I think that's pretty comprehensive about me. I am now on the job market, so I'm about to graduate with my degree at the end of this year, and then I will hopefully go on to a teaching job where I'll be a professor at like a small liberal arts type college or an instructor at like a larger college or university.
All right, that's great. Now let's go into the conversation. So, Molly, could you tell us how children form beliefs about what is required to be successful? So when did they start to form beliefs about aspects like being a natural genius or needing science and math to be successful?
Yeah, that's such a great question. That is really the basis of what my research program looks at. So it was sort of inspired by some research that finds that children starting around age 6, kids begin to report that boys are more likely to be really, really smart than girls. So before that time, when kids are around like 4 and 5, girls will say that girls are really, really smart, and boys will say that boys are really, really smart. So that's what we call like an own gender preference. And then as children get older, that shifts. So boys continue to have that own gender preference, but girls start to also favor boys as well. So that's what we call the gender brilliance stereotype. And it's this idea that there are some groups that are less likely to be considered to have this innate natural talent. And I think a really important part of my research is that brilliance is not the same as smartness, right? So brilliance is something that is, we think of it as something that we're born with. You either have it or you don't. It's not something that you can learn over time or try harder at to get better at. And so that's why it's a particularly tricky concept, because if we believe that only certain people that have this trait are going to be successful, but the only way to have this trait is to really be born with it and naturally have it, then that will serve as a barrier for those that might be interested in the field that are not, that may be stereotyped to not have these qualities. So we've found that with women and particularly people of color as well. People believe that it's really something about white men, it seems like, and that starts really, really young. And also the other important part of that is it might be fine, right? It doesn't really sound like a bad thing that we would want super smart people to be doing important jobs like computer science or chemistry or physics or things like that. But the problem is that that's also not super realistic about how people are successful in these fields. Anyone who is a successful person at like the highest of levels had to work really hard to get there. I think it's sort of it's a combination of these two different things. It's this belief that you have to be brilliant in order to succeed in these fields, as well as this belief that certain people lack this capability. And so those two things together lead to a bunch of downstream consequences. But my research has mostly focused on the aspect of what fields do kids believe need brilliance. And what I've found in some of my dissertation work is that starting around somewhere between age 6 and 8, children begin to report that computer science requires brilliance, but that biology doesn't. And so that's kind of like the first bit of finding where kids, they're not just saying that you need to be smart to be a scientist. They're saying that some type of scientists, you need to be really smart. And that's important because there's also this belief that women are underrepresented in science generally, and that's actually not true. So women are underrepresented in certain science fields like like computer science, physics, and math, but they're not. It's about equal in terms of gender distributions in fields like biology, chemistry is another one, health sciences like doctors and nurses and things like that. So I think it's a really important way to be talking about this because it seems to have these like important consequences for who tends to pursue these fields.
That's really amazing that humans start to form stereotypes at such an early age. So, do you know what kinds of environments, family, school, media seem to most strongly influence these early beliefs?
Yeah, totally. So I don't think we know on a scale of like which one is the most strongly, but there is evidence that all of those things have something to do with the way kids think about these stereotypes. So there's been evidence that teachers who hold these more like fixed mindset beliefs that you're born a certain level of smart and you can't get better even if you try, they're more likely to I believe it's teachers who haven't started yet, but who are going into fields like math are more likely to hold those beliefs than teachers going into fields like reading and writing. So that's one potential source, right? If a teacher believes this, then kids might be able to pick up on it. There is also some evidence with children's media as well. So there's some work on just in general, the representation of scientists in media. Kids are much more likely to see men as scientists in the media than women. But I'm actually doing some work where we're investigating the messages about these different types of scientists. So we're looking at a popular children's media called Brain Pop. Have you ever used Brain Pop before?
No.
Okay, it's like really popular in schools and things like that. It's like educational children's videos, and they make little mini documentaries about famous scientists and artists. So we're interested in seeing whether they describe the different types of science using more of that brilliance language for those fields that we know are more associated with brilliance, like computer science. So when they're talking about someone like, who's a good example? Like Alan Turing, I think is technically a computer scientist. There's a few others, and versus like someone like Charles Darwin, who's a very famous biologist. Do they use more brilliance focused language for those famous computer scientists versus those famous biologists? So we don't have results for that yet, but that is something that we're interested in and we're looking at. And there was one more that you talked about. Was it parents maybe?
Yeah, family.
Yeah. So I also have another study that I'm working on now. It's actually like a two-part study. The first part of it is looking at how whether children and parents share similar beliefs about these different fields. So if your parent thinks that, you have to be really naturally gifted to be good at math, are kids more likely to also, are their children more likely to share that same belief? So that's more of like a correlational analysis that these two things may be like similar. And then we're doing another study after that where we're actually observing parents and children talk about these different fields. So we have 4 different fields that we're looking at: math, computer science, biology, and food science. And we're asking parents to talk about these conversations, and we're going to analyze them for this like very brilliance focused language and see whether parents who use more brilliance focused language have children that have stronger brilliance beliefs about those fields. So I think it's kind of a developing area of research, but I'm really excited to be working on it.
Yeah, it is actually very interesting that these external factors start influencing young children at such an early age, especially since like in today's driven world, there's so much media content that kids are consuming at such a young age. So could you please describe the psychological mechanisms that underline the development of ability-related stereotypes in children?
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely something that we're still working on as a field, I think, in terms of psychological mechanisms. So as we said before, there are a lot of different potential social sources of these information, like you said, like parents, schools, media. But I think in terms of like what mechanisms specifically, I do have one study that actually touches on that a little bit. So I have one study in the pipeline where we're trying to understand whether children see stereotypes as psychological barriers. So we know children understand physical barriers to different fields. So for example, if you present children with a toy and you show them like a physical barrier as to why a kid couldn't get to that toy, even if it's gendered, like even if it's a doll and it's a girl, if the child chooses the truck over the doll because of these like structural physical reasons, like because the doll is up on a really tall shelf and the truck is sitting on the floor in front of the kid, then kids can understand that there are barriers as to why children might choose certain things. So we are trying to understand whether the presence of stereotypes, so hearing that like science is for boys or computer science is only for boys, would be something that kids understand might make them not want to join it in the future. Or like join a club or subsequent club. And so we do find that as early as age 5, children begin to understand the presence of stereotypes. So overhearing someone say something like, boys are better than girls at math would make a child less likely to want to actually join that club later. So understanding these barriers, understanding these stereotypes as a barrier, I think is like one potential mechanism and could be one way of thinking about how to fix these things.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really good description. So are there noticeable developmental differences in how boys and girls view their own competence in STEM fields over time?
Yeah, that's also an awesome question. And it's a really interesting one because some of the work I was telling you about before, where we find that around age 6, boys and girls both are more likely to say that boys are more brilliant. It's really interesting because in that same study, they also asked kids who was more likely to do better on schoolwork, like tests and things like that. And children pretty reliably report that girls achieve better grades. So they understand that girls perform well in school, but they also tend to think that boys are more brilliant. So that's like kind of an interesting contradiction. And there is a lot of evidence that children begin to kind of deviate. There actually was just a new recent study that came out asking children about, it was children all the way up through like 12-year-olds, so like child through adolescence basically. And they were asking kids about their stereotypes about different fields. And they found that children didn't really have strong stereotypes about the fields of math and science more generally. So they were like pretty much equally likely to say that boys and girls were good at those fields. But for more specific fields like engineering and computer science, both boys and girls were more likely to say that those fields were more for boys, or it's stereotyped as boys being better at that. And that seems to be something that increases with age. So we might not see it as much with like the younger kids, maybe like 5 and 6-year-olds, but by the time kids even hit middle school, there seems to be a gap in interest anyways. And there's been many arguments about whether that interest is like, maybe that's a natural thing. Maybe that's just like something they were born with too, right? That kids are like, boys are naturally more interested than girls in these fields. And that I think is a really dangerous way of thinking about these things because as I talked about, there are all of these different factors that are telling kids who can be good at these things and who should be good at these things. And so if they come to the conclusion that actually this isn't for girls, it's likely not just because they happen to be uninterested. It seems like there was something that was like pushing them away from that. So it happens pretty young.
That's amazing. And probably that's the root cause that needs to be fixed to increase the participation of girls and women in STEM. So how do early stereotypes in math and science fields about math and science ability affect the actual academic performance or career aspirations in later life?
Yeah, that's also something that we're kind of still working on figuring out, that like long-term trajectory of how these things influence kids. But I will say, thinking about some of the work with adults and with college students as well, we've seen that the more that particularly women endorse these field ability beliefs. So the more they think that certain fields require brilliance, the less interested they are in those fields. And so that happens through a couple of pathways, one of which being it lowers motivation, right? So you might just be like, I'm not really interested in doing something. There's also an increase of bias and discrimination. So women who are in fields that have these like strong brilliance beliefs tend to experience more discrimination or they feel as if they are being discriminated against more frequently in the workplace. And they're also more likely to leave the profession. So they're less likely to join the profession and also more likely to leave the profession, women particularly in those fields, because they feel like unwelcomed, They feel that there's, not really a place for them. They feel like they're being judged more harshly. There was some really interesting data or I don't know if it's actually data, but there was some speculation about, I guess there's been some differences between AI usage between women and men in the workplace. So men are more likely to use AI at work than women are, which is a really important topic right now because AI is really big everywhere. And it was funny, my partner asked me, what would your take on that be as a developmentalist or as a person, as a psychologist who works on gender? And I thought about it for a minute and I was like, I think it might have something to do with competence because women are very concerned with how competent they appear in the workplace because there is this stereotype that they lack competence, right? That they lack this ability. And so that was my speculation. I was like, I think it's competence. I think women would worry that using AI would signal that they're incapable of this task on their own. And so they would actually be punished for that. Whereas men would be seen as, trailblazing and, being the first to take on like a new thing. And sure enough, there was some data that came out like 2 days later and it was exactly what I had said. It was like exactly competence belief. So I think that's also one thing that like women are always kind of monitoring their competence in these situations in a way that because they know they have this stereotype. And that's also some older literature has worked on this in the term, oh my goodness, am I going to be able to remember it? Stereotype threat. There we go. So stereotype threat is this idea that if you know there's a stereotype about your group's ability, and especially if there is attention called to it. So one of like the big studies on this was in like a college classroom. They were like, all right, you're going to take a math test. And before it, they had women like do some tasks that really like re-emphasized their gender before the test. And when they did that, they were more likely, or they performed worse basically than women who didn't have attention called to their gender before they took it. So if there's this identity that's stereotyped and you highlight this identity, that could actually lead to some of these downstream consequences.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So we should try to address these stereotypes early on. So how can teachers, parents, or policymakers use findings from your work to foster more equitable and inclusive learning environments?
Yeah, that's totally something that I'm thinking a lot about. How can we make this practical? I would say one really big thing is just not using this brilliance-focused language. So it's on its head, it doesn't seem like a bad thing to say that your child is a genius or someone is a genius because it seems like a compliment. But the problem there is with this definition of what genius is, it sort of implies that you can achieve things without working hard, that you were born naturally able to do these things, and it discounts a lot of the hard work that goes into anything, right? So, especially horses, I think are a great example, right? Like lots of people try to ride horses, but not everybody who makes it to the top levels, everybody who makes it to the top levels had to work hard to get there, right? So if you want to go up a level, you have to work hard to get there. And I think that emphasizing that hard work aspect and de-emphasizing the ability aspect is a really important thing that parents, everyone can do, is to emphasize the language around that. And also to just not use a generic language is another really big problem. So describing scientists as like one group can be really harmful. So saying like scientists do this or scientists do that. Well, some scientists do this. Some scientists do this other thing, right? Some scientists work alone a lot, and some scientists work in big groups. Some scientists work with people every single day, and some scientists never talk to people. So being less generic and more specific about the different things, the different types of science parents are talking about, and exposing children to science as an entire spectrum of things that they could be interested in, I think would be one helpful way that parents can incorporate this into their everyday lives.
That's great. So can you share an example of an intervention that successfully shifted children's perceptions? Also, how can children's books, toys, or media be reshaped to avoid reinforcing biased notions of who is smart?
Yeah, there's a couple interventions that come to mind out of our lab. So one that comes to mind is there was a study that one of my colleagues did kind of recently where they were interested in whether role play. So one suggestion people often give in order to get particularly girls more motivated in in science, different types of science, is to include role models, to include scientists who can talk to these young girls and tell them about their experiences and stuff. And that's great, but it also places a burden on these women, right? So there's less of them because we know that there are gender disparities in who achieves these top levels. So it might take a lot of time. And also, it isn't really necessary. There's a lot of like open questions about like what about a role model is actually specifically motivating. So they took a different approach where they had children role play as a role model, and they like introduced them to this fictional character, Dr. Sam. And Dr. Sam was a great scientist, and they manipulated whether they talked about Dr. Sam as either naturally brilliant or as hardworking. And then they asked kids to do a persistence task after. And they found that compared to just telling kids about Dr. Sam, kids who role played were more likely to persist on the task. So one thing could just be role playing. So thinking about a scientist and pretending that you are them might be like potentially motivating. Another intervention that we've done that I think has also worked, there was another one that came to mind. Oh yes, I have another paper that we worked on where children, we changed the motivation. We were introducing kids to a science job, it was urban ecology. And we told them about a role model, and we did two different messages about the role model. So it was either a growth message about interest and ability. So either she like never really knew what she wanted to do, but she tried out a bunch of different things and she decided on urban ecology. So she grew her interest over time, and she like wasn't naturally very good at science and math, but she worked really hard. And so she was successful. So in that was one of the conditions, the growth condition. And then in the fixed condition, we told them, this urban ecologist has always been interested. She always knew she wanted to do this. And she also has always been really good at it as well. And what we found was for girls of color, particularly, those growth messages made them more interested in, more motivated in pursuing urban ecology than when they heard those fixed messages. But interestingly, for white girls, the difference was much smaller. There really was not a statistically significant difference. So it seems like those growth messages might be particularly important for these girls who are sort of doubly stereotyped, right? So their racial group and their gender group are both stereotyped as lacking this ability. So those are just two examples of things that have kind of worked.
That is really cool. So now viewing from a slightly different angle aspect. So what roles does culture play? For instance, are there societies where girls are more likely to be associated with brilliance than boys?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I think we're really still kind of figuring this out, but there have been many cross-cultural studies looking at this idea of brilliance and comparing across different racial groups. And so there was one that they did in New York City, and they asked both white children and children of color about both white targets and Black targets. And what they found was that children overwhelmingly associated white men with brilliance. And then they also did it in, I believe, Singapore, and there's one other, maybe Japan, I believe, another like Eastern country. And all of them have replicated these same findings that white men are associated with brilliance. But another interesting thing is that when you're comparing, children often associate Black women, Asian women, those two specifically. I don't want to overextend it to Hispanic women because I can't remember if they've actually done that one yet or if I'm thinking of something else. But in general, children are more likely to attribute brilliance to Black women over Black men and Asian women over Asian men. But in terms of like a whole spectrum, if we had to like make a pyramid, we don't really have that sort of comparative data yet. It just seems like when we're thinking about white men and women, we're more likely to think that white men are brilliant. But then when we're thinking about other racial groups, that doesn't always extend. So it's still kind of an open question that a lot of really smart people are working on answering.
Interesting. So I had also Googled this, and I found that Scandinavian countries also consider girls more intelligent than boys. So This was an amazing talk. I would like to close the discussion by asking you about what your long-term goals are for this research. How do you hope it will inform public policy, education, or parenting?
Yeah, I think I'm really hopeful that in the long run, this will help make STEM a more equitable field. So I would love to see women, especially in fields like physics and computer science. I would love to like change the perceptions about those fields as being a place for only like nerdy geniuses who don't like to be social. I think that that's a real detriment to our society because I think women have a lot of really important ideas to contribute in these areas. And these are also very socially mobile areas. So those jobs pay really well. And there's like a lot of really good reasons why women would want to be in those fields. So that's my hope for this research program. And I'm hopeful that I'm able to do that by, again, becoming a professor and working with my own students that I can mentor and come up with more research to both support this idea and convince people that these brilliance beliefs are really important and they do really matter, as well as trying to find solutions to them and figure out the ways in which we can mitigate these messages from taking place in the first place.
That's awesome. Molly, I would like to thank you for an amazing conversation and for being a guest speaker on my channel. I've learned a lot about this interesting topic. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much.